The living room buzzed with conversation and laughter as guests mingled at Tom's housewarming party. The spacious apartment had quickly filled with friends, co-workers, and neighbors, creating a lively atmosphere that spread through every corner of the newly decorated space. Soft music played in the background, barely audible over the chatter of nearly 30 people sharing stories, jokes, and compliments about the new place. Tom moved between groups with ease, making sure everyone had drinks and felt welcome. His easy smile and warm personality had always made him popular, though sometimes his playful nature crossed into teasing that went a bit too far. He was the type who loved being the center of attention and often created moments of entertainment at gatherings. In one corner of the living room stood an old upright piano, its wooden surface showing signs of age and character. It had been left by the previous owners, and Tom had decided to keep it more as a decorative piece than an instrument. He'd mentioned once or twice that he planned to learn to play someday, but everyone knew that day would likely never come. As Tom refilled the snack bowls, he noticed his coworker Grace standing alone by the bookshelf, looking at the titles with quiet interest. She worked in the accounting department at their office, and while they weren't close friends, they'd shared enough small talk during lunch breaks to develop a friendly rapport. Grace was known for her thoughtfulness and skill with numbers, but she kept to herself most of the time. Tom had invited her more out of courtesy than expectation that she would actually show up, and he was genuinely surprised when she arrived, dressed simply but elegantly in a blue sweater and dark jeans. "Finding anything worth reading?" Tom asked, approaching with 2 glasses of punch. Grace looked up, a slight smile warming her face as she accepted the drink. "You have good taste in books. I wouldn't have guessed you'd be a fan of classic literature." "There's a lot you don't know about me," Tom replied with a playful wink. "I'm full of surprises." Their conversation drifted from books to work and then to hobbies. Tom mentioned his recent interest in hiking, while Grace talked about her love of cooking. The exchange was pleasant but unremarkable, until Tom asked if she had any other interests. "I used to play a bit of music," Grace said casually, taking a sip of her punch. "Nothing serious, just something I did growing up." "Really? What instrument?" Tom asked, his interest piqued. "Piano, mostly." "But it's been years," she replied with a dismissive wave of her hand. I probably couldn't remember a single piece now. Something about the way she downplayed it sparked Tom's mischievous side. Perhaps it was the 2 beers he'd already finished, or maybe it was his natural inclination to create memorable moments at parties. But an idea formed in his mind that he couldn't resist. "Hey, everyone," Tom suddenly called out, his voice cutting through the various conversations around the room. Heads turned in their direction and Grace's eyes widened in surprise. "Did you know that Grace here is a pianist?" Grace immediately shook her head. "Tom, no, I just said I used to." "We have this beautiful piano just sitting here collecting dust," Tom continued, ignoring her protest and gesturing dramatically toward the instrument. "I think we deserve a little performance, don't you all agree?" Several guests clapped and cheered, while others looked on with curious expressions. The music playing through the speakers was turned down, creating an expectant silence that filled the room. "Come on, Grace," urged Lily, one of Tom's friends who had overheard. "Give us a little something." Grace's cheeks flushed pink. "Really, it's been forever. I wouldn't remember anything," she insisted, but Tom was already guiding her toward the piano with a hand on her shoulder. "Just a quick tune," Tom pressed, his smile wide and encouraging. "Even Mary Had a Little Lamb would be fine." "It'll be fun." The crowd had formed a loose semicircle around the piano, drinks in hand, waiting for what they assumed would be an amusing attempt at playing. Tom stood with his arms crossed, a satisfied grin on his face as he orchestrated this moment of entertainment. Grace hesitated by the piano bench, visibly uncomfortable with being the center of attention. Her fingers fidgeted with the hem of her sweater as she looked at the expectant faces around her. Tom noticed her discomfort but mistook it for simple shyness or perhaps embarrassment about her rusty skills. The thought that she might actually be distressed didn't cross his mind. "You can do it," he encouraged, giving her a thumbs up. "No pressure, just for laughs." A few people in the crowd nodded in agreement while others watched with varying degrees of interest. Some had already turned back to their own conversations, assuming the moment would pass without anything noteworthy happening. Grace took a deep breath and slowly sat down at the piano bench. She adjusted its position slightly, a seemingly automatic gesture that Tom didn't register as significant. Her posture changed subtly as she sat before the instrument. Her shoulders relaxed even as her spine straightened. "I haven't played in front of people in a long time," she said quietly. But Tom just nodded encouragingly. "That's why it's perfect. Nobody expects anything fancy. Just have fun with it," he replied, leaning against the wall nearby. In his mind, this would be a quick, possibly awkward moment that everyone would laugh about. The kind of harmless party story that might be retold at the office on Monday. Grace placed her hands on her lap and stared at the keys for a long moment. The room had grown quieter, though not completely silent. A few whispered conversations continued in the back, and someone laughed at a joke in the kitchen. Tom checked his watch discreetly, already thinking about the next round of drinks he needed to prepare. "I'm not sure this piano is even in tune," Grace said, pressing a single key experimentally. The note rang out clearly, surprising her. "Oh, it's not bad, actually." She pressed a few more keys, testing the action and feel of the instrument. Tom nodded with satisfaction, pleased that his impromptu entertainment idea was proceeding as planned. He expected her to fumble through something simple, maybe hit a few wrong notes that would make everyone chuckle good-naturedly before they all moved on with the party. Grace closed her eyes briefly, as if searching her memory for something she could play. Her fingers hovered uncertainly over the keys, and Tom felt a moment of pride at having successfully created this little scene. "Just play whatever comes to mind," he encouraged, "even if it's just Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star." A few people laughed at this, and Grace's lips curved into a small smile that Tom couldn't quite read. Was it embarrassment? Amusement? Resignation? She positioned her hands over the keys with a deliberateness that Tom failed to notice. Her fingers spread with practiced ease, finding positions that felt like home despite the years away from the instrument. She took another deep breath and glanced up at Tom one last time. "All right, but remember you asked for this," she said softly. Tom grinned broadly and gave her a playful salute. "The stage is yours, maestro." He leaned back against the wall, taking a sip of his beer and preparing to enjoy what he assumed would be a brief, amusing moment of watching his usually reserved co-worker attempt to recall childhood piano lessons. Some of his friends exchanged knowing looks, clearly sharing his expectation of entertaining awkwardness. Grace adjusted her position on the bench one final time. Her eyes focused on the keys with unexpected intensity. The chattering in the room had dimmed further as more people turned to watch, curious about the impromptu performance about to begin. Tom checked his phone quickly, noting the time, 9:17 p.m. He had no way of knowing that in just 10 seconds, by 9:17 and 10 seconds, his smug smile would be completely wiped from his face, and this little joke would transform into something he never expected. Grace placed her fingers on the keys and paused for just a heartbeat, as if reuniting with an old friend. And then she began to play. The first notes filled the room like raindrops on a still pond, clear and purposeful. Grace's fingers moved with surprising confidence across the keys, producing not the stumbling melody Tom had expected, but something rich and complex. The opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor rose from the old piano, transforming the living room in an instant. 10 seconds. That's all it took for Tom's confident smirk to dissolve into pure astonishment. His mouth fell slightly open as he watched Grace's hands dance across the keyboard with practiced precision. The gentle questioning notes of the introduction gave way to flowing arpeggios that cascaded like water. The piece began softly, almost tentatively, but even in these quiet moments there was unmistakable skill in every note. The conversations around the room died away completely. Someone quietly set down a glass. Another person stepped back from the snack table, forgotten chip halfway to their mouth. All eyes turned toward the corner where Grace sat at the piano, her body now relaxed and swaying slightly with the music. Tom couldn't tear his gaze away. The woman at the piano barely resembled the quiet accountant he knew from work. Gone was the hesitation, the shyness, the careful reserve. In its place was someone utterly transformed, confident, expressive, lost in the music she created. Her fingers moved with a fluidity that spoke of years of training, not the casual used to play a bit she had claimed. He felt a sharp pang of regret twist in his stomach. What had he done? What he intended as a light-hearted joke, possibly at her expense, had become something else entirely. Something he didn't fully understand yet. As the piece developed, gaining momentum and intensity, Tom noticed how Grace's whole being seemed to connect with the music. Her eyes were half closed, her expression shifting with each change in the composition. When the music grew more passionate, her shoulders rose and fell with deeper breaths. During gentler passages, a slight smile touched her lips. This wasn't someone dusting off half-remembered lessons. This was an artist reuniting with her craft. Lily appeared at Tom's side, nudging him with her elbow. "Did you know?" she whispered, her eyes wide. Tom shook his head slowly, unable to find words. He had never felt so completely wrong-footed at his own party. The joke was on him now, and everyone knew it. The music swelled, filling every corner of the apartment. Even through the limitations of the aged upright piano, the beauty of Chopin's composition shone brilliantly. Grace approached a particularly difficult passage, her left hand making impossible-looking leaps while her right spun out delicate, ornate melodies. Tom noticed a small bead of sweat on her forehead, the only sign that what she was doing required immense concentration and skill. People had begun to gather closer to the piano. Some sat on the floor nearby, others leaned against walls or furniture, but all watched with rapt attention. The atmosphere in the room had shifted entirely, from casual party chatter to something approaching reverence. A few guests who had been in the kitchen or on the balcony had drifted in, drawn by the unexpected concert taking place in the living room. Tom felt rooted to his spot, a complex mixture of emotions washing over him. Embarrassment, certainly. He had misjudged Grace so completely, but also wonder at the hidden talent now revealed, and a peculiar sense of privilege at witnessing something so unexpectedly beautiful. Most of all, though, he felt shame for having put her on the spot, treating her skill as something to be mocked rather than celebrated. As Grace approached the middle section of the piece, where thundering chords alternate with delicate runs, Tom noticed something remarkable. She was no longer paying attention to anyone in the room. The audience had disappeared for her. She was somewhere else entirely. Her face reflected every emotion in the music. Melancholy, yearning, brief moments of joy, and undercurrents of something deeper and more complex. "Who is she?" Someone whispered nearby. A friend of a friend Tom barely knew. "She works with me," Tom replied quietly. "In accounting." The stranger shook his head in disbelief. "She should be on stage somewhere." The comment made Tom wonder why she wasn't. What had led someone with this level of talent to a desk job processing numbers? What story lay behind her dismissive, "I used to play a bit"? There was clearly so much about Grace he, and likely everyone at the office, had never bothered to discover. The music reached a particularly intense section, and Grace's body tensed with concentration. Her fingers flew across the keys with remarkable speed and accuracy. Even to Tom's untrained ear, it was obvious that this was no amateur performance. This was years of dedicated practice, of passion, of understanding the music on a fundamental level. He thought back to all the times he'd seen Grace at work, quietly efficient, helpful but never drawing attention to herself. How many times had he nodded hello without really seeing her? How many times had he made assumptions based on her quiet demeanor? The thought made him deeply uncomfortable. The piece continued its emotional journey, now reaching moments of such tenderness that Tom noticed one of his friends discreetly wiping away a tear. Another sat with eyes closed, completely absorbed in the experience. Even those who knew nothing about classical music were clearly moved by the performance. Tom glanced at his watch again. Nearly 5 minutes had passed since Grace had begun playing, though it felt both longer and shorter somehow. Time altered by the unexpected beauty of the moment. The piece was building toward its climax now, growing more complex and passionate with each measure. Grace's technique remained flawless, even as the demands of the music increased. Her hands stretched to reach wide chords, her fingers moving with incredible independence. There was power in her playing now, the gentle introduction long forgotten as the full emotional range of the piece unfolded. Tom found himself holding his breath during particularly intense passages. He had never paid much attention to classical music before, had certainly never felt it affect him physically like this. Heart racing, palms slightly damp, completely caught up in the suspense of where each phrase would lead. As Grace approached the final section of the piece, with its whirlwind of notes leading to a dramatic conclusion, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Her hands moved in a blur across the keyboard, drawing sounds from the old piano that seemed impossible. The final chords rang out with decisive force, echoing in the suddenly silent room. For several seconds after the last note faded, no one moved or spoke. Grace remained at the piano, hands still resting lightly on the keys, eyes closed, breathing deeply. The spell wasn't yet broken. Then, as if released from a trance, the room erupted in applause. People stood cheering and clapping with genuine enthusiasm. Someone let out an appreciative whistle. Faces all around showed the same stunned admiration, the same delighted surprise. Grace finally turned on the bench, her cheeks flushed with exertion and emotion. She looked almost surprised to find herself the center of attention, as if she too had forgotten where she was while playing. Her eyes sought out Tom's in the crowd, her expression a mixture of emotions he couldn't quite read. Tom felt frozen in place as the applause continued around him. What could he possibly say to her now? How could he explain the joke that had backfired so spectacularly? The teasing comment he had planned, something along the lines of, "Well, that was better than I expected," now seemed impossibly crude and thoughtless. As the applause finally began to die down, people moved toward Grace, surrounding the piano with questions and compliments. Tom watched as she smiled shyly, answering quietly, her hands now clasped in her lap. The transformation was remarkable, the confident artist gradually receding, the reserved accountant returning. Yet now everyone knew that both existed within the same person. Someone asked her to play something else, and others quickly joined in the request. Grace glanced around, clearly overwhelmed by the attention but also touched by the genuine appreciation. "Maybe just one more," she conceded, turning back to the keyboard. Tom remained where he stood, still processing what had happened. In just a few minutes, his perception of Grace had been completely upended. The quiet coworker he thought he knew had revealed depths he hadn't imagined, and his own role in the evening had shifted from confident host to humbled observer. As Grace positioned her hands to begin another piece, Tom knew he would need to speak with her, to apologize for putting her on the spot, for treating her talent as a potential source of amusement. But he also felt strangely grateful for his own mistake. Without it, this remarkable moment would never have happened. The room quieted again as Grace began to play once more, this time a gentler, more wistful melody. Tom finally moved from his spot by the wall, finding a place where he could see her face as she played. He wanted to understand what he was seeing, the connection between the person and the music, the story behind the talent. As the new piece filled the room with its sweet, melancholy tone, Tom realized something important had changed. Not just his view of Grace, but something about himself. The joke he had intended had revealed a truth he needed to learn, about making assumptions, about really seeing people, about the hidden depths that exist in those we think we know. Grace played on, her music filling the room with beauty none of them had expected to find at a casual housewarming party. And Tom listened, really listened, for perhaps the first time. The second piece Grace played was Debussy's Clair de Lune, its gentle, flowing melody washing over the room like moonlight on water. The mood had shifted entirely from the energetic party atmosphere of an hour ago to something more intimate and reflective. Guests sat on floors leaned against walls, or stood in doorways all transfixed by the unexpected concert taking place in Tom's living room. Tom had found a spot near the kitchen where he could observe both Grace and the reactions of his guests. The wonder on their faces mirrored his own feelings, surprise giving way to appreciation, then to something deeper. He watched as Grace swayed gently with the music, her expression peaceful and focused. This was a side of her he'd never imagined existed during their brief interactions at work. When the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, the applause was immediate, but somehow more reverent than before. People exchanged glances of shared amazement, small smiles of delight at having witnessed something truly special. "That was beautiful," someone said softly as the clapping subsided. Grace nodded in acknowledgement, her hands now resting in her lap. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible above the murmurs of appreciation filling the room. "Where did you learn to play like that?" asked Keith, one of Tom's neighbors. Grace tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a gesture Tom had seen her make during difficult meetings at work. I started lessons when I was 6, she explained, her voice gaining a little strength. My grandmother was a piano teacher. Did you study professionally? Another guest asked. A brief shadow crossed Grace's face. I was at Eastman School of Music for 3 years, she said after a slight pause. Tom's eyebrows shot up in surprise. Eastman was one of the top music conservatories in the country. This wasn't just casual talent. Grace had been on a professional path. What happened after 3 years? Lily asked, then quickly added, if you don't mind me asking. Grace glanced down at her hands, now resting on her knees. Life happened, she said simply. Then with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, she stood up from the piano bench. I think that's enough music for tonight. People began to disperse slowly, some stopping to thank Grace personally, others returning to interrupted conversations, though the tone of the party had noticeably changed. The music playing through the speakers was turned back up, but it seemed flat and lifeless compared to what they'd just experienced. Tom knew he needed to talk to Grace, to apologize for putting her on the spot, but she was now surrounded by admirers. He busied himself in the kitchen, refreshing drinks and arranging more snacks while keeping an eye on her. She accepted compliments graciously but with obvious discomfort at being the center of attention. Eventually, the crowd around her thinned as people drifted into smaller conversation groups. Tom saw his opportunity when Grace slipped away toward the balcony door, a glass of water in hand. He followed her outside, where the cool night air provided a welcome break from the warmth of the crowded apartment. Grace was leaning against the railing, looking out at the city lights spread below them. She didn't turn when the door slid open, but her shoulders tensed slightly, suggesting she knew someone had joined her. I thought you might like this, Tom said, holding out a small plate with cheese and crackers. You didn't get a chance to eat anything earlier. She turned and accepted the plate with a small nod. Thanks. Tom leaned against the railing a few feet away, giving her space. The silence stretched between them, not exactly uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. I owe you an apology, he finally said, looking out at the skyline rather than directly at her. I put you on the spot for my own entertainment. That was thoughtless. Grace took a small bite of cheese before responding. You couldn't have known. That's not really an excuse, though, is it? Tom said, turning to face her now. I made assumptions. I thought it would be funny to watch you fumble through chopsticks or something. A hint of a smile touched her lips. And instead you got Chopin. Yeah, Tom said with a self-deprecating laugh. Talk about a backfiring joke. He paused, then added more seriously. You play beautifully. I've never heard anything like that in person before. Thank you, Grace said, her voice soft but steady. It felt good to play again. It's been a while. Tom wanted to ask how long, wanted to know the story behind her life happened comment, but sensed it might be too personal for their current relationship. Instead, he asked, Does anyone at work know you're basically a concert pianist? She shook her head. It doesn't really come up in budget meetings. I guess not, Tom agreed. They fell into silence again, but it felt more comfortable now. The sounds of the party drifted out to them. Laughter, music, the clink of glasses creating a backdrop to their quiet conversation. You know, Tom said after a moment, I've worked with you for almost a year, and I realized tonight that I don't really know you at all. Grace turned to study his face, as if checking whether the comment was sincere. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her. Most people don't try to, she said simply. The words hit Tom harder than he expected. Was that true? Did he only engage with people on a surface level, looking for what they could add to his life rather than who they really were? I'd like to change that, he said, surprising himself with how much he meant it. Grace raised an eyebrow. Because I can play Chopin? No, Tom replied quickly, then paused to consider. Well, maybe that's what got my attention. But it's more that I realize there's clearly a lot more to you than I ever bothered to find out. Grace seemed to weigh his words, her expression thoughtful. Finally, she nodded slightly. I suppose there's more to most people than we initially see. Inside, someone called Tom's name. Probably a question about where to find more ice or which bathroom to use. He ignored it for the moment. Can I ask you something? He said, leaning a little closer. You don't have to answer if it's too personal. Grace set down her empty plate on a small table. You can ask. Why accounting? When you can play like that, why spreadsheets and quarterly reports? She looked back out at the city lights, and for a moment Tom thought she wouldn't answer. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but clear. I injured my hand during my 3rd year at Eastman, she said, flexing her right hand slightly as if remembering. Nothing dramatic, no car accident or fall downstairs. Just repetitive stress that turned into tendinitis, then a small tear. By the time it healed properly, I'd missed too many performances, lost my scholarship, and she trailed off with a small shrug. Music at that level doesn't leave room for setbacks. But you can still play amazingly, Tom pointed out. I can play for enjoyment now, she corrected him. Not 6 to 8 hours of practice daily. Not the competition circuit. Not the constant pressure. She turned to face him fully. And honestly, there's something peaceful about a job where no one expects perfection from me every minute. Tom hadn't considered that perspective before. He'd always assumed artists would choose their art over anything else if they had the talent. The idea that someone might deliberately step away from that world, even partially, was new to him. Inside, his name was called again, more insistently this time. You should go, Grace said. Your guests need you, Tom hesitated. Will you stay? The party's probably going to wind down soon anyway, but I'll stay a little longer, she agreed. Relief washed over him, though he wasn't entirely sure why it mattered so much. Good, and maybe we could talk more? I mean, not just tonight, but… Tom. The sliding door opened and Lily stuck her head out. Phone call. Your neighbor downstairs says the music's too loud. I'll be right there, Tom said, then turned back to Grace. Sorry, I need to go, she said with an understanding smile. It's fine. As Tom headed back inside to deal with the complaint, he glanced back to see Grace still standing at the railing, her face tilted up toward the night sky. Something had shifted between them tonight, something important. The joke that had backfired had opened a door to understanding that might otherwise have remained closed. In the living room, several people were gathered around the piano again, one of Tom's friends picking out a simple tune with one finger. The instrument that had been merely decorative just hours ago had become the heart of the gathering, transformed by Grace's talent just as the evening had been transformed by her unexpected revelation. Tom dealt with the noise complaint quickly, turning down the speaker volume and promising to start winding things down soon. As he moved through his apartment, he found himself seeing his guests differently, wondering what hidden talents, passions, or stories might lie beneath the surface of each person. The evening had reminded him how little we often know about the people around us, how many assumptions we make based on limited information. When he made his way back to the balcony, he was disappointed to find it empty. For a moment, he feared Grace had left without saying goodbye, but when he returned to the living room, he spotted her sitting in a corner, deep in conversation with Keith, who taught music at a local high school. They were talking animatedly, hands moving to illustrate points, both looking more engaged than they had all evening. Tom smiled to himself and didn't interrupt. There would be time to continue their conversation, at the office perhaps, or over coffee sometime. The important thing was that he now saw Grace differently, and maybe she saw him differently too. The joke had backfired in the best possible way, reminding him of the depths that exist in people if only we take the time to notice. As the party continued around him, Tom found himself glancing repeatedly at the piano, remembering those first 10 seconds when everything had changed. Some lessons, he reflected, were worth the momentary regret they caused. This was definitely one of them. Monday morning arrived with the usual bustle of office life. Tom stepped off the elevator on the 14th floor, coffee in hand, mind still lingering on the events of Saturday night's party. The weekend had given him time to reflect on his interaction with Grace and the unexpected way the evening had unfolded. He'd replayed those incredible moments at the piano countless times in his mind, still amazed by the hidden talent his quiet coworker had revealed. As he walked through the accounting department toward his own office in marketing, Tom slowed his pace, eyes scanning the cubicles. He spotted Grace at her desk, already focused on her computer screen, a spreadsheet reflected in her glasses. She looked exactly as she always had. Hair pulled back neatly, simple blue blouse, posture perfect as she typed. Nothing in her appearance hinted at the artist who had mesmerized his living room 2 nights ago. Tom hesitated, suddenly unsure about approaching her. At the party, their conversation on the balcony had felt significant, a turning point. But in the fluorescent reality of Monday morning, surrounded by the hum of printers and ringing phones, he wondered if that moment had been as meaningful to her as it had been to him. Before he could decide whether to stop by her desk, his phone buzzed with a message from his boss about an urgent client call. With a last glance at Grace, who hadn't noticed him, Tom continued to his office. The workday consumed him after that. Meetings, deadlines, a presentation to prepare. The ordinary rhythm of corporate life took over. It wasn't until lunchtime that Tom found himself in the break room at the same time as Grace. She was waiting by the microwave, lunch container in hand, scrolling through something on her phone. No one else was around, a rare moment of quiet in the usually busy space. "Hey," Tom said, approaching the coffee machine. "How's your Monday going?" Grace looked up, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she smiled. "The usual. Quarterly tax preparations wait for no one." Tom nodded, searching for something more meaningful to say than workplace small talk. "I've been thinking about your performance all weekend," he admitted. "It was really special." A hint of color touched her cheeks. "Thank you. It was nice to play for an appreciative audience again." The microwave beeped, and Grace removed her container of soup. The moment seemed about to slip away as she gathered a napkin and spoon from the counter. "Actually," Tom said quickly, "I wanted to ask you something." Grace paused, turning back to him with a questioning look. "My mom's birthday is coming up next month," he explained. "She used to play piano too, nothing like your level, but she loved it. She had to sell her piano years ago when they downsized to a smaller place." He hesitated, then continued, "I was thinking of getting her an electronic keyboard, something compact that would fit in their apartment. But I don't know the first thing about what makes a good one." Grace set her lunch down on a nearby table. "That's a thoughtful gift," she said, her expression warming. "What's your budget?" "Around $500. Is that enough for something decent?" "It can be," she nodded. "There are some good options in that range. The key is finding one with weighted keys that feel like a real piano." Tom felt a surge of relief at her engaged response. "Would you maybe help me pick one out? I'd really value your expertise." Grace seemed to consider this for a moment. "I could do that," she finally said. "I know a few shops that have good selections." "That would be amazing," Tom said, trying not to sound too eager. "Maybe this weekend if you're free? We could grab coffee afterward." A small, amused smile played at the corners of Grace's mouth. "Are you asking me to go piano shopping or asking me on a coffee date?" Tom felt heat rise to his face. Both? I mean, primarily the piano shopping, but the coffee would be nice too. As friends," he added hastily, then winced at how awkward he sounded. Grace's smile widened slightly. "Saturday afternoon would work for me," she said. "There's a good music store in Oakwood that carries quality keyboards." "Saturday it is," Tom agreed, relief washing over him. He pulled out his phone.
"Should we exchange numbers?"
"For coordinating?" After they swapped contact information, Grace picked up her lunch again. "I should eat this before my next meeting," she said. "Of course." Tom nodded, then added, "Thanks for agreeing to help. I really appreciate it." "It's nice to use my musical knowledge for something practical," Grace replied. With a small wave, she headed back toward her department. Tom returned to his office feeling lighter somehow. Their workplace interaction had been brief but felt like a continuation of the connection that had begun at the party. The barrier that typically existed between work acquaintances seemed to have softened, if not dissolved entirely. Throughout the week, they exchanged occasional text messages, Tom confirming details for Saturday, Grace sending links to keyboards she thought might be worth considering. Their interactions at the office remained casual but friendly, with small nods of recognition when passing in hallways or brief conversations by the coffee machine. When Saturday arrived, Tom found himself taking extra care with his appearance, nothing fancy. Just a clean button-up shirt instead of his usual weekend t-shirt, and his newer jeans rather than the worn ones he typically lounged in. He told himself it was simply about presenting himself well for a day out. But he couldn't deny the flutter of anticipation he felt while waiting outside the music store where they'd agreed to meet. Grace arrived precisely on time, dressed in jeans and a simple green sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders instead of in its usual office style. The casual setting immediately made their interaction feel different, two people choosing to spend time together rather than coworkers thrown together by circumstance. "Ready to find your mom a keyboard?" Grace asked with a warm smile. Lead the way, Tom replied, holding the door open for her. Inside, the store was a musician's paradise, guitars hanging on walls, brass instruments gleaming in display cases, sheet music filling shelves along one side. Grace navigated confidently toward the back where a selection of keyboards and digital pianos were arranged. So, she said, stopping before the display, there are a few things to consider beyond just the weighted keys I mentioned. How serious was your mom about playing? Did she practice regularly? She played almost every day when I was growing up, Tom said. Memories surfacing of his mother at their old upright piano, playing everything from classical pieces to Beatles songs. She was pretty good, taught lessons to neighborhood kids for extra money. I think she really misses it. Grace nodded thoughtfully. In that case, we should look for something that will feel satisfying to someone with experience. She gestured toward several models. These have the best key action in your price range, and this one has particularly good sound samples. What followed was an education Tom hadn't expected. Grace moved from keyboard to keyboard, explaining the differences in touch sensitivity, polyphony, a term he'd never heard before, and sound quality. She demonstrated each one briefly, her fingers dancing over the keys in short musical phrases that highlighted various features. Tom watched, fascinated both by the information and by Grace herself. In this environment, surrounded by instruments, she was transformed again, confident, knowledgeable, completely in her element. The shy accountant was nowhere to be seen. Can I ask you something personal? Tom said during a pause in her explanations. Grace looked up from examining the connections on the back of a keyboard. You can ask, she said, echoing her response from their balcony conversation. Do you miss it? The life you were training for at Eastman? Her hands stilled on the keyboard. For a moment, Tom thought he'd overstepped, but then she straightened up and met his eyes directly. Sometimes, she admitted, but it's complicated. The professional classical music world is intense, beautiful, but brutal. There's tremendous pressure to be perfect every time you perform. After my injury, I had time to think about whether I wanted to fight my way back into that world. And you decided you didn't, Tom said softly. Grace ran her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down. I decided I loved music too much to let it become something that caused me pain and anxiety. So now I play for myself when I want to, how I want to. A small smile touched her lips, and occasionally at housewarming parties when put on the spot. Tom winced. I'm never going to live that down, am I? Probably not, Grace laughed, and the sound was unexpectedly light and free. But it turned out okay, didn't it? Their eyes met, and Tom felt something shift between them. A deeper understanding, perhaps, or the beginning of something neither had anticipated. The moment was interrupted by a store employee asking if they needed assistance. Grace turned to him, explaining exactly what they were looking for with such clarity and knowledge that the employee quickly deferred to her expertise. After trying several models, they eventually settled on a keyboard that balanced quality and price. A Yamaha with fully weighted keys, good sound, and a compact design that would fit in his mother's apartment. She's going to love it, Grace assured him as the store employee wrote up the order. It's an excellent choice for someone returning to playing after a break. Thanks to you, Tom said sincerely. I would have been completely lost trying to pick one out on my own. Happy to help, Grace replied. It was fun, actually. I don't often get to talk about this stuff anymore. As they left the store, the afternoon sun was warm on their faces. The coffee shop they'd agreed on was just a block away, and they fell into step beside each other, conversation flowing more easily now after their shared task. So if you're not planning to return to the concert stage, Tom said as they walked, do you ever think about using your musical knowledge in other ways? Teaching, maybe? Grace considered this. I've thought about it. Maybe private lessons someday on my own terms. I actually started a music blog last year. Reviews, historical pieces about composers, that kind of thing. It's small, but it keeps me connected to that world. I'd love to read it, Tom said, surprised by how much he meant it. He'd never had much interest in classical music before, but seeing it through Grace's eyes had changed something for him. I'll send you the link, she promised as they reached the coffee shop. Inside, over lattes and shared pastries, their conversation ranged widely, from music to books to travel dreams to workplace stories. The awkwardness that had lingered at the office had completely disappeared. replaced by a genuine connection that surprised them both. "You know," Tom said as their coffee date stretched into its second hour, "I've worked in the same office as you for nearly a year, but I feel like I've learned more about you in the past week than in all that time." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "Work doesn't exactly encourage showing our full selves, does it? We all have our professional personas. Still," Tom persisted, "I wish I'd made more effort to get to know you sooner." "Well," Grace said with a slight smile, "sometimes it takes a backfiring joke to break through those barriers." Tom laughed, shaking his head. "Best mistake I ever made, putting you on the spot like that." As the afternoon light began to fade outside the windows, they finally gathered their things to leave. Standing on the sidewalk outside the coffee shop, Tom felt reluctant to end their time together. "Thank you again for today," he said, "for the keyboard help and just for a really nice afternoon." Grace's smile was warm and genuine. "I enjoyed it too. Much more than I expected to, honestly." "Maybe we could do it again sometime?" Tom asked, trying to sound casual. "Not the keyboard shopping part, obviously. But I'd like that," Grace said simply. As they said their goodbyes and headed in opposite directions, Tom couldn't help thinking about those 10 seconds of regret at his party. How quickly embarrassment had turned to wonder, and how that moment had opened a door to something unexpected and valuable. Sometimes, he reflected, our mistakes lead us exactly where we need to go. 3 months had passed since that fateful housewarming party. The seasons had changed, summer warmth giving way to autumn crispness, and with that change came others in Tom and Grace's lives. What had begun as an awkward joke had blossomed into something neither of them had expected, a friendship that deepened with each passing week, bridging the gap between work colleagues and something more meaningful. Tom stood in his living room adjusting a framed photo on the wall. His apartment looked different now, more lived in, more personal. The old upright piano, once merely decorative, had been tuned and restored. It sat in pride of place near the window, no longer gathering dust but regularly filling the space with music. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Grace, on my way. Traffic on Main Street. Be there in 15. Tom smiled, glancing around to make sure everything was ready. Today marked exactly 3 months since the party, and he had invited a small group of friends over for dinner, a casual gathering to celebrate nothing in particular, though he had a surprise planned that made his heart beat a little faster whenever he thought about it. The doorbell rang just as he lit the last candle on the dining table. When he opened the door, Grace stood there holding a bottle of wine and a small gift bag. She looked different than she had at the first party, more relaxed, hair loose around her shoulders, wearing a deep blue dress that brought out her eyes. But the biggest change was in her smile, warm, genuine, and without the caution that had once characterized her expressions. "Right on time," Tom said, stepping back to let her in. "Unlike some people I know," Grace teased, handing him the wine. They had developed an easy banter over the months, built on shared jokes and growing understanding. "That was one time," Tom protested with a laugh. "And the movie previews are the best part anyway." Grace's eyes moved to the piano as she entered the living room. "You got it tuned," she said, noticing the open sheet music on the stand. "Last week," Tom nodded. "The technician said it's actually a pretty decent instrument. Apparently the previous owners took good care of it." Grace crossed to the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them down, a gesture Tom had come to recognize as almost unconscious on her part. A pianist's instinct to connect with the instrument. "Are you finally taking those lessons you talked about?" she asked, noticing the beginner's book open on the stand. Tom rubbed the back of his neck, a little embarrassed. "Trying to. I'm terrible, but it's surprisingly fun. Though my neighbors might disagree about the fun part." The past 3 months had seen many changes in their relationship. After the keyboard shopping excursion, they had begun spending time together outside of work. First coffee, then lunch, eventually dinners and weekend outings. Tom had attended a classical concert with Grace, discovering to his surprise that he enjoyed it far more than expected. Grace had joined Tom for a hiking trip, revealing a competitive streak he found both surprising and delightful. At work, their friendship had raised a few eyebrows at first. The outgoing marketing manager and the reserved accountant made an unexpected pair. But people had grown used to seeing them together in the break room or heading out for lunch. Office gossip had speculated about romance, But the truth was both simpler and more complex. They were building something careful and genuine, neither rushing nor labeling what was developing between them. The doorbell rang again, interrupting Tom's thoughts. Over the next half hour, the apartment filled with friends, some from the original party, some new faces Grace had introduced from her own circle. The atmosphere was warm and relaxed, conversation flowing easily among people who had come to know each other over the past months. Dinner was casual, a potluck-style meal with dishes spread across Tom's dining table. As they ate, laughter and stories filled the apartment. Tom found his gaze drawn repeatedly to Grace, who was deep in conversation with Keith about a community music program he was starting for kids. She had begun volunteering with the program recently, finally finding a way to share her musical knowledge that felt right for her. After dinner, as people gathered in small groups with dessert plates and wine glasses, Tom caught Grace's eye and nodded slightly toward the piano. She raised an eyebrow in question, but he just smiled and excused himself from his conversation. Tom tapped a spoon against his glass, drawing everyone's attention. "Thanks for coming tonight," he said when the room quieted. "It's great to have friends together like this." There were murmurs of agreement and raised glasses around the room. "Some of you were here 3 months ago when I made what might have been the most embarrassing and simultaneously luckiest mistake of my life," Tom continued, glancing at Grace with a smile. "I put someone on the spot as a joke and ended up with my foot in my mouth and my mind completely blown. People who had been at the first party laughed, while those who hadn't looked curious. For those who missed it, I basically challenged Grace to play this piano, thinking she'd fumble through chopsticks or something. Instead, she sat down and played Chopin like she was at Carnegie Hall." Grace shook her head slightly, color rising in her cheeks, but she was smiling. "Anyway," Tom went on, "that moment changed things for me in ways I'm still discovering. It reminded me not to make assumptions about people. It showed me how much beauty can be hiding in plain sight if we just pay attention." He paused, then added more softly, "And it introduced me to someone who's become very important in my life." The room had grown quiet, the atmosphere shifting from casual to something more meaningful. Tom cleared his throat. "So I've been working on something," he said. "A surprise. And I'm probably going to regret this just like I regretted putting Grace on the spot. But," he moved to the piano and sat down, adjusting his position on the bench with exaggerated formality that made everyone laugh. Grace's eyes widened in realization. "Tom, you don't have to—" "Oh, but I do," he replied with a grin that didn't quite hide his nervousness. "Fair is fair." Tom placed his hands on the keys, took a deep breath, and began to play. The piece was simple, a basic arrangement of Beethoven's Für Elise that most beginners learn, but he played it with careful concentration, each note deliberate. It wasn't polished or perfect. He hesitated at certain transitions and missed a few notes entirely, but there was something touching about the earnestness of his effort. The weeks of practice evident in the sections that flowed smoothly. Grace watched him with an expression that shifted from surprise to tenderness. When he finished, the room burst into enthusiastic applause, far more enthusiastic than his playing warranted, but genuine in its appreciation of the gesture. Tom stood from the piano with an exaggerated bow. "And that, ladies and gentlemen, is about 3 months of practice. I think we can all agree that some of us are more naturally gifted than others." People laughed, and the gathering returned to its casual rhythm. But as the others resumed their conversations, Grace made her way to Tom's side. "That was quite a surprise," she said quietly. "Too cheesy?" Tom asked, suddenly uncertain. Grace shook her head. "It was sweet and brave. I know how nervous I was playing for everyone that first night." "Well, I had considerably lower expectations to meet," Tom laughed. Then more seriously he added, "I wanted you to know that your music inspired me. Not just to learn piano, though that's been fun even if I'm hopeless at it, but to look for beauty in unexpected places. To pay better attention to the people around me." Grace was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face. "That night at your party," she finally said, "I almost didn't come. I almost deleted your invitation without responding." "I'm glad you didn't," Tom said softly. "Me too," Grace replied, "and I'm glad you put me on the spot even if it wasn't your finest moment." "I still can't believe you forgave me for that," Tom said. Grace smiled. "Some mistakes are worth forgiving." Her hand found his, fingers intertwining with a familiarity that still felt new and wonderful, especially when they lead somewhere important. Across the room, someone had put on music and others were clearing a small space for dancing. The evening stretched ahead, full of possibilities. Speaking of leading somewhere, Tom said, nodding toward their friends. Would you care to dance? Grace squeezed his hand. I'd love to. As they joined the others, moving together to the music, Tom marveled at how differently this gathering felt from the one 3 months ago. The joke that had backfired so spectacularly had set in motion changes neither of them could have predicted. Grace was no longer just the quiet accountant from down the hall, and he was no longer the guy who only saw people for what they could add to his social life. Later in the evening, after many of the guests had left, Grace found herself back at the piano. Without fanfare, she began to play. Not Chopin this time, but something gentler, a piece by Einaudi that filled the apartment with its simple, emotional melody. The remaining friends gathered around, drawn by the music just as they had been that first night. Tom stood nearby, watching her play with the same wonder he had felt 3 months ago, but now accompanied by deeper feelings, admiration, affection, and something more that was still taking shape between them. When Grace looked up and met his eyes, continuing to play without missing a note, he knew with sudden clarity that his impulsive joke had been the best mistake he'd ever made. The regret he had felt in those first 10 seconds had given way to something far more valuable, a reminder that people contain depths we rarely see at first glance, that beauty often hides in unexpected places, and that sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best beginnings. As the music surrounded them, Tom silently thanked whatever impulse had led him to put Grace on the spot that night. Some mistakes, it turned out, were exactly what we need to make, even if we don't know it until 10 seconds later.